All right, we're live. Hello, everyone. My name is Brendan Bordelon. I'm the tech lobbying and influence reporter at Politico, based in Washington, D.C. I should just say right off the front, I am not an antitrust or competition reporter, although I have dabbled quite a bit in this. So please bear with me here. We're here today to talk about how talk about how industry influence government policies as they relate to artificial intelligence. That's clearly a timely topic, including from an antitrust and competition perspective. I know many of you were at the dinner last night where Khan and Conter very deftly kind of dodged questions related to AI concentration. So it's clearly something that's top of mind for regulators and antitrust practitioners. Before we get started, I just want to remind everybody to take the online poll. Stigler Center is all about that, and they very much value your perspective. I also want to have a quick housekeeping note. Conter mentioned this last night. The AI kind of means all things to all people and there's a very wide range of definitions. In our context, what we're going to be talking about today is very specifically generative AI, and I guess also you can sort of rope in large language models. So these are the kind of, I think, relatively new technology that powers things like ChatGPT, OpenAI's ChatGPT, Anthropic's Claude, these chatbots that are sort of uncannily lifelike. Obviously, as well, these models will create works that are virtually indistinguishable from those created by artists, and they can often produce videos and pictures that are indistinguishable from reality. That's obviously raising a lot of concerns among policymakers. We also want to touch a little bit about the kinds of AI that might be coming next. So this is things like artificial general intelligence. That's basically an AI model that can do a wide range of tasks similar to what your average human can do. And then we also want to reference at least the potential for AI to move beyond even AGI into the sort of super spooky realm of super intelligence. And I know some very powerful voices in and around the tech industry are interested in these alleged risks of AI, whether it builds into AGI, builds into super intelligence. And they are very interested in pushing policymakers in Washington and around the world to focus on those risks as well. So we're going to be talking about that, but just wanted to have some sort of quick setting the stage here for the kinds of AI we're talking about. Now I'm going to introduce our panelists very briefly. So we have Anat Admati. She's the George G.C. Parker Professor of Finance and Economics at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. I've got Nur Ahmed here. He's a postdoctoral associate at the MIT Sloan School's Initiative on the Digital Economy. Nick Feamster. He is the Neuberger Professor of Computer Science at the University of Chicago. So we got a local on the panel. And then Corynne McSherry is legal director at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So I'm going to tee up the first question and then hopefully shut up a little bit and let our panelists get into it. So the rise of generative AI has lit a tremendous fire in Washington and in capitals around the world, where this overwhelming sense has emerged that something must be done to regulate the technology. Momentum started to build last April. That was when Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer announced plans for a bipartisan legislative framework on AI. We've been waiting for that framework for quite a while, and I've been told it's coming any week now. So we'll stay tuned on that. This February, the House of Representatives also announced a bipartisan AI task force. That's led by Representatives Jay Obernolte and Ted Lieu. You guys, some of you at least, I'm sure, are aware of President Biden's signing of an AI executive order in October, this very sprawling piece of, not legislation, but obviously something that has pushed agencies to continue to implement a variety of policies in a variety of sectors on AI. Then there is work going on at the Commerce Department, both at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They are standing up an AI Safety Institute. Certainly a lot of industry influence into that organization at the moment, although it's very early days. The National Telecommunications and Information Administration, they just received a bunch of comments from a wide variety of stakeholders on open source AI, the risks and benefits of that. So this is by no means an exhaustive list. There's a lot going on, particularly in Washington and around the world as governments try to regulate this. So, and in all of this, the influence of the tech industry and really all kinds of industries with a stake in how AI is going to be regulated and how it's going to roll out, that influence has loomed quite large. And it's not just through traditional lobbying or through public testimonies where we typically see industry weigh in. Tech billionaires tied to leading AI labs have increasingly been funding the staffers working on AI policy in Capitol Hill and across federal agencies. A handful of tech companies have been directly funding these staffing programs on Capitol Hill, at the White House. The aforementioned billionaires, they've also sunk hundreds of millions of dollars into the think tanks and the academic institutions that are driving much of the AI conversation in Washington at the moment. And in some cases, they're even directly crafting the White House's approach to AI regulation. There has been a significant amount of influence from that money to the AI executive order. So similar dynamics are playing out across the world, including in the United Kingdom, European Union, and Brussels. And in all these cases, there's a lot of concern, I think, including among folks on this panel, that the leading or the largest AI firms are using this array of open and hidden levers to really push their preferred policies and viewpoints, particularly around AI safety and how to sort of secure these systems in an effort to both sort of distract from the existing harms of artificial intelligence and also to sort of wall themselves off from competition through sort of very high regulatory walls, particularly around AI safety. So I'm just going to kick it off from here, and I think I'll start with Nick, if that's okay. To what extent do you feel like industry is sort of the loudest voice in the room at the moment when it comes to AI policy development, and where's the risk there? Do you see a risk there in how this is developing?
Thanks, Brandon. And I should preface this by saying you're starting with the probably the least expert of this topic on this panel. I was starting with Nur in the hallway just before this, saying, "Oh, I see. So you're studying people like me." So just a little bit of background on who I am and I think why I'm sitting here. I am not an expert on generative AI or generative AI policy. However, over the years, through my work in internet measurement, as well as internet censorship, content moderation, both in this country and elsewhere, and then pushing into like the use of AI to moderate content on the internet, I've certainly, my research and my activities have certainly run up against attempts to regulate in various forms. And throughout my, I would say, 20 to 25 year history doing work in those areas, the story repeats itself. I should also mention I've certainly looked at the role of AI and automated techniques for things like copyright enforcement and as it pertains to the DMCA takedown, content moderation, and all these realms. I think the story repeats itself, and I think I don't need to repeat what you said in the opening, which is that lurking behind not so thick veneer of regulation is usually a few very small, powerful incumbents, essentially trying to use regulation to maintain their dominance in the marketplace. And by the way, it's not always the same one. If we look at, as I mentioned, 15 years ago, I started working on broadband policy. The incumbents there are certain part of the industry. In the content moderation space, certainly as it pertains to AI, I think we know who the incumbents are there. So it's not always the same incumbents, but I think what comes up in all of these scenarios is two things. One is it makes it hard for new entrants. So if you look at sort of the use of AI in the copyright and content moderation space, some of the regs that have basically talked about the needs to moderate in super fast timescales, typically that basically implies the use of AI. Sometimes very expensive. Either if you're an incumbent, they have those tools in-house. Content ID, for example, being one. So either you're an incumbent who develops and has those technologies, or you have the money to pay for them. So that basically boxes out anybody but the entrenched incumbents, including startups, but also researchers. And I think as we sort of pivot to the topics of today, you mentioned Gen AI, et cetera, I think the story is repeating itself. I think it's very hard to enter these markets without access to lots and lots of data already. You mentioned, I think, the use of regs in AI safety as a particular area. I think another topic that the last panel talked about, and we can get into if we want, is certainly access to data and creating walled gardens as a means for further entrenching incumbents. And so I think that's certainly one active area. And then I think I'll stop talking in just a second. But another area as an academic that I think we can see, and we can certainly talk more about this because we have a long panel ahead of us, is even prior to the rise of Gen AI, I think we see a few dominant players, incumbents in things like the paper review process, as well as just the involvement of academics cross-pollinating with industry, we see a few very dominant players in that dynamic. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you teed that up right away, because I think that's been a key sort of through line in a lot of my reporting on this subject, is the nexus between academia, the think tank world, which is quite dominant in this space in Washington in particular, and industry. And so I'll just, what I've come across quite a bit in the AI space is this sense that given the funding structure for a lot of these think tanks, for a lot of academia and researchers in this space, there is a pretty significant incentive for them to come up with research conclusions that often line up with the policy priorities of their funders, either directly or indirectly. And so my focus has been on the AI safety space. So I've talked to a lot of researchers, mostly anonymous, in the biosecurity and biotechnology world, that have come across this issue where there will be they will basically be pushed by their program directors to come up with some sort of nexus between AI and biorisk that they may not actually see a lot of evidence for, but where their funders, which are often, they're getting money from tech billionaires, a very small handful of tech billionaires, will very much want to see some sort of outcome saying, hey, well, if you can find a way to find out that the AI models coming down the pike are going to boost biosecurity risks in a major way. Maybe there'll be a new bioweapon that'll be developed. That'll be great. That'll give us another, $3 million in the next grant. So actually, I'm going to go to Anat here. I'm curious, the extent to which you see that playing out, in the AI space, and whether this is sort of a long-running thing that you have observed in your scholarship, the extent to which industry and industry funders and folks affiliated with industry directly or indirectly really kind of put their thumb on the scale when it comes to research and, I think what should be unbiased or nonpartisan work in these kinds of emerging tech spaces.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for inviting me. I also am not an AI expert, but I do reside in Stanford, and we have a lot of money coming into a center called Human-Centered AI, HI. Very, very well resourced. What I've witnessed most is somehow my entry into policy space, coming as a finance academic, was actually another sector. And I saw it in such ways that certainly translate in every way I could see to tech in just about every way. Now, the genesis of a lot of this engagement is traced back to maybe the Powell memo from 1971, in which the subsequent Supreme Court justice wrote a memo to the Chamber of Commerce in which he basically outlined a plan to take over and invest heavily in shaping up the knowledge of people through media and through academics and every other way. And in the academic sphere, there was a lot said about funding research, funding researchers, giving opportunities to researchers, affecting the curriculum, you name it. It was all there. And it was taken seriously, and it was the start of a major campaign that not all of it was new, but certainly that's played out in the last 50 years since or more, to do just that, to affect the judiciary, to affect media outlets, to affect academia. So this panel's title, which you didn't start with, you started just talking about AI, is what actually convinced me to come here. They found this cute title for me to, I've been here before, and it's a great conference, and I'm a good friend of Stigler Center. I've been a big admirer of the work and collaborator. This conference was not funded by big tech or by tech, something like that. And so the thought experiment is, what if it was? Would it have been different? If it was funded by tech, which a lot of conferences are. I see a lot of conferences on banking and on finance funded, either in think tanks that you mentioned or in academic institutions in various centers, almost all of which are funded by industry people, which are not what an independently funded conference would look like. They often involve a lot of industry people speaking. They choose certain academic papers that they like and exclude others that they don't like. And I have many stories of that, including one occasion in which there was a conference at Stanford Business School, my own home, funded by a lobbying organization that led me, let's just say, after I don't want to give too many details here. I was thinking, what do I give on the record versus you get a glass of wine and I'll tell you with the names.
Do it here. Come on. Yeah.
A conference after which the sponsoring organization complained about an op-ed I wrote that they didn't like and implied that Stanford should have stopped me from writing that op-ed. So not even understanding. Now, I happen to have found out about it, but most of the time I wouldn't have. So it was a coincidence that I did. But it led me to go to my dean and say that if there was one more penny coming from this organization to Stanford Business School, that I will go to the media and speak about that. And so that ended it at Stanford. However, the same organization or the subsequent evolution of that organization, now called Bank Policy Institute, is still funding conferences at Columbia, for example, Tano. And you can be sure I'm not invited to these conferences. So you can see the conferences are different for being funded by an industry lobbying group. So there are very subtle ways in which our knowledge gets distorted, and even academic conferences get distorted through this funding by industry. So that's directly to the question of this panel. And I'm quite sure that if some of the big tech companies that we discussed, at least that we had case studies on, were funding this conference, the coverage of these past cases and future outlook would have been a little bit distorted away from the discussion we did have. So I value, and I think we should all pay attention to who sponsors conferences.
Thank you, Anat, and thank you also for calling me out for not mentioning the panel title at the start. So I really appreciated that. So Corynne, I'm going to go to you as I think maybe a little bit more of an AI specific expert here to just ask to the extent to which you see the kind of dynamics that Anat is describing generally across industry, spanning decades, specifically in the AI space. How that's playing out, the extent to which industry money, a handful of tech billionaires are really starting to put their thumb on the scale when it comes to policymaking in AI, whether it's specific policy approaches or just sort of the general tenor of the conversation, where you see things moving and the extent to which this is an AI specific problem.
Yeah. So I do think it is a problem. I don't think it's an AI specific problem by any means. But I do think I would offer sort of two points of reference, or maybe three. So one is, the way that tech billionaires affected this is that there was the Sam Altman roadshow, and all of a sudden everyone in Congress is like, what is this AI thing? By which they meant generative AI, but they don't say that. They just say AI. And he scared all of them with a lot of hype and a lot of anxiety, and the new singularity is coming tomorrow. And one of the results of that, I think, was it did become a distraction from what I think are the real harms and the real potential harms of algorithmic decision-making about the use of AI in all kinds of systems that is already happening, already documented, already real. But it's fun for Congress to have hearings and, bring the executives and yell at them in public, and they get little, nice little sound bites from that. And tech billionaires don't like to do that, but I think it was interesting that I think a few of them have figured out, actually, if we do this judiciously, a little bit carefully, maybe this can work out for us. But it skewed the policy conversation that should actually happen. But the other thing I want to say about this is that there's a lot of industries in the room. There's a lot of money in the room, part of the conversation, and it's not all AI companies. It's also Hollywood and Hollywood industrial associations, and there's a lot of money there too. So there's a lot of talk about copyright, obviously, but also publicity rights. There are several bills that are actually moving and being introduced and having hearings that are focused on publicity rights and intellectual property issues at least as much. So I just think that's eating as much energy up as AI safety or anything else. And what is not being discussed enough is the other kinds of AI harms. Now, I will say that the Biden executive order is an exception to this. I think to their credit, they crafted a very sprawling order that includes mandates for agencies to actually look at how they're using algorithmic decision-making and so not generative AI, but reminding them that they should be paying attention to this other thing they're already doing that has this putting people in jail and kicking people out of homes and so on. So whenever I talk about this, and I think this is what Biden did, is take the AI hype and actually try to turn it towards the real thing that we should be worried about. And so to the extent that that happens, that's great. But there's a lot of money there too, and I worry about how that's going to turn out. But at least I do feel like the silver lining of the conversation, and what I think is an impoverished conversation in a bunch of ways, is that maybe we get a fuller conversation coming out of it, which is what I would like to push for. And it's just one specific anecdote for this. Sorry. I was at a round table, and I'm not allowed to name who was there or exactly what they said for Chatham House rules, which was fine. But I just want to tell you, I was at a round table with a prominent congressperson, and I was the only public interest person in that room. And trust me, EFF had way less money than anyone else at that table. And that happens over and over and over. In organizations like mine or a couple other ones, we sort of get invited to be like, so what do the users think? Like, look, it's going to represent all of the users, and that's not right. So either way, I think there's multiple industries who are influencing the future of policy, but there's still not nearly enough conversation with civil society groups, public interest groups, and just, regular consumers. And there's a reason for that. Startups even, there's a reason for that. Those people can't afford to send people to all of these meetings and conferences and so on. And it's a real power imbalance. And this isn't specific to AI. But I think in the context of AI, I think it's especially important to be paying attention to it. Because really this technology is having very, very significant effects or potential significant effects on all kinds of people. And if they're not in the room, if they're not represented, it's just undemocratic. And just fundamentally, we're going to miss a lot of what we need to know about how this technology is affecting people.
So many good threads to pull on there, but I'm gonna focus on one for now, and if I could go to Nur for this. So I think the pushback from industry and folks affiliated with them, to Corynne's point, would probably be, look, the expertise resides with us in AI. So there's just not, civil society is great, but civil society isn't sitting here watching every day as we develop this intensely fast-moving technology. We are the ones who have visibility into the risks and also the potential rewards of these technologies in a way that virtually no one else does. You need to listen to us because we're the only ones who know what's going on. Nur, how would you respond to that? Do you buy that argument? I think we all probably would agree that industry at least needs a seat at the table, but are they the primary voice, and should they be the primary voice given their expertise and their views into how this is all developing?
Right. Thank you. So I'm super excited to be at this conference. I'm Nur. So I do research on commercialization of science. I'm very pro-industry. So I'm very much in favor of that companies innovate and they commercialize the science and create products for all of us. But what I care about is they should do that in a responsible manner. So that's what I study. And to answer your question, so industry does have a lot of influence broadly in AI research. So last year I published a paper which actually documented that industry dominates all the top AI benchmarks. They hire the majority of AI Ph.Ds. They sponsor a lot of these major conferences, and they have all these compute power as well as data sets. So they dominate broadly the research trajectory in AI research. So, and because of that, they get a seat at this table for policy making. And the issue is, what I noticed is that, it's only industry leaders, primarily industry leaders, who are in that room with, say, the Prime Minister of the UK or the Vice President of the United States. And more recently, so I'm a Bangladeshi Canadian citizen, more recently I saw that Canada also started an AI Safety Institute, again, very much influenced by people with that kind of views, like industry-minded views. But we are not seeing enough conversations or enough input from people who are also experts, like who are thinking about the real harms that Corynne was mentioning. So I think there are a lot of academics who are pointing out a lot of issues, but I don't think policymakers at DC or, London or Brussels are paying enough attention to these others' voices.
Yeah, well, and let's, we've kind of danced around the real harm question, but, what are the real harms that you feel like policymakers are being distracted, from addressing?
Yeah, so one point I wanted to make is that, these tools, so, ChatGPT was launched in 2020 November. Google actually built the earlier version in January 2020. So the reason Google did not commercialize that product at the time was internally they felt that product was not ready, right? And OpenAI launched ChatGPT because they were worried that someone else would commercialize this product. Someone else would launch that product. And actually, OpenAI scientists were very surprised to the reaction that public loved that product so much. Because OpenAI just launched ChatGPT, and 4 months later, they were planning on launching GPT-4. But the public really appreciated ChatGPT. And so so that means commercial interest made them to launch that product, which was not ready to be commercialized. So the real harm would be so imagine that so some organizations start using GPT-4 for content moderation. And that kind of content moderation might penalize certain kinds of communities more than others. Imagine that there is a real company that is using GPT-4 or similar kind of models, APIs, to check resumes. And then, so that's going to, again, affect probably certain kinds of communities more than others. And actually, OpenAI recently said 600,000 enterprise users are using their APIs. And those are real commercial entities. And that means, and we know for sure, GPT for the latest model has at least 3% hallucination rate. Again, I agree with Laura, we should not use the term. So they make up stuff at least 3% of the time, the most advanced model in the world, and 600,000 commercial entities are using that model in their day-to-day products and whatnot. So I think that's where the harm is. And policymakers should talk about what are you doing to reduce that kind of limitations of your technology. Is it even ready to be commercialized?
Yeah. And I should note as well, to Corynne's point, that while it's not technically generative AI or LLMs, the algorithmic bias concerns that have persisted for quite some time are also roped into this discussion. And, it's things like facial recognition and the impact that could have on minorities and policing and that kind of thing. So that's all part of this conversation as well.
Brandon, can I just pick up on that real quick?
Please, yeah.
So I just want to say that from what you mentioned right now about using ChatGPT or other AI programs for content moderation, because there was just an article that was circulated at EFF yesterday, and the title was, "Can ChatGPT be the future, the solution for content moderation?" And the answer was no. I mean, I had to read the article. No, it's not. But it also helps explain, a lot of us who do this work, we don't do this work because we care about competition per se or necessarily about AI per se. I work for a civil liberties organization. So why are we working on this? Because this is going to have an impact on free expression. How this technology is used is going to have an impact on free expression, on privacy, all those kinds of impacts that are not always easy to anticipate, but we exist precisely to make sure that technology serves our civil liberties and doesn't impair them. But it's really important to be keeping an eye on those impacts. And I feel like that's another thing, that those kinds of impacts get lost in the focus on what the commercial benefits might be.
Anat, you said you wanted to.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on a few threads that were here. First of all, distraction. This is a big industry kind of tactic. Buying time. I mean, this goes back to tobacco and, climate change. And, we don't know. We're not sure. Let's just sit around talk all the time. The predecessor on tech was a debate on social media harm and all of that. How many hearings did we have? Nothing happened. So again, it's a spectacle. You bring the CEOs, how many times did Mark Zuckerberg come before Congress and what happened? Like nothing so far. So it's very similar here. Now this is the shiny object AI. This is the buzzword AI. And so now let's have a talk about it all the time. But, there are basic things, and this goes back to the discussion in the previous panel as well. Are there laws that we should enforce? One of my biggest concerns, and I sort of alluded to, do we know the truth, all of that, is just, stuff about authentication, deep fakes. This preceded the hallucinations of AI. This is deep fakes. This is where you don't know whether a video is authentic or a picture is authentic. So I mean, that's very basic. In the digital communication space, we don't know what's true. We don't know who to trust. I now, ChatGPT made it difficult for me to teach, okay? I had orals for my student, back to orals. I don't know what they can write on a piece of paper and where it came from. And I know that they're using ChatGPT because they sometimes forget to take the final, thing. I'm a bot, please check this. They forget to take it off. So that just gives me a glimpse of the ones that didn't even bother to take off the text. So, get them in a room, they'll present. The ChatGPT is not in the room, ask them questions, back to that. So kind of all the way around, for Socrates or something in a room. So from all the digital education we were going to have, does anything ever get through? Does anybody learn anything? So all of that. So that concerns me as a teacher. But in general, the information environment has just gotten out of control. How do we have a society? How do we have a democracy when people don't know who anybody ever said? So we have to start with, okay, I don't know what you can make these companies release. So we have a First Amendment, freedom of speech, all of that. But can you require watermarks? Can you actually, get somebody who claims that the picture is authentic to, authenticate that picture, or put pressure on the companies to have that kind of basic content moderation, that when we see a picture, we know it's a picture was taken and not made up, or a video, or something like that. There is a technology to authenticate. So now it's like so easy to generate content, and then we get completely confused by it. So I just want to start basic, and I also want disclosure for researchers that you can mandate that. In other words, there are things we can do. So this notion that we're going to sit around and talk to the end of days without both thinking about basic stuff that's wrong, dark patterns, whatever, and basic information environment and safety, where, again, it was mentioned before, we have safety rules, we can have disclosure rules, disclosure to researchers, disclosure to people who are harmed about what content gets seen, all of that, aggregates. That's not controlling people's speech. That's just giving us the information to research the impact of this stuff.
Yeah. And Anat, to your point about the many things that Congress could theoretically do to get down on these harms, and then I think your corollary that in the past they've often talked a lot about this, and then that's all that we've seen. We're understandably, we're bringing industry through the ringer here. But I want to ask Nick, and also maybe Corynne in particular, the extent to which Congress, specifically, and I think Washington generally, bears some of the blame for their own lack of expertise in this space. So I've talked to industry folks, and I've written stories about how industry, either directly or indirectly, has funded a lot of the staffers who end up working on the Hill on these issues, working at the agencies on these issues. And they'll say, we're filling a vital need because Washington has essentially allowed itself to atrophy when it comes to tech expertise. There is staffers don't stay around for very long when they're working on the Commerce Committee or anything like that. And there needs to be these voices in the room that can speak intelligently about these issues consistently over time. And
Pay them.
Yeah, well, sure. We're the best position to do that. So Nick, I guess, to your point, I mean, do you bring Washington in and partially to blame for this? And is there a way, if Washington was to resource, to Anat's point, pay full-time tech policy staffers, would that ameliorate some of the issues we're talking about right now?
I guess who's going to pay for that is the taxpayer.
Sure.
So I don't know how much money do we want to spend. But I think that's certainly an issue. I think there's a distinct lack of tech and specifically computer science expertise in Washington. I don't know if that's to blame. It's certainly, I think the lack of vision is certainly rooted in some of that. I think, like I said, I'm not an expert in what's happening right now or what's about to happen as more than anybody else in the room here. But certainly over the last few decades in other areas, I've watched Washington boot it like over and over and over again, because I think you see staffers or regulators in a commission with just enough expertise to know how to write a regulation that like sounds good, but they just do not understand the ramifications of what they're writing. And like tech is it moves quicker than the law. It also is a lot more far-reaching than I think someone who basically just reads a few briefs can really understand. And that's not to say that tech has the answers. Like certainly there's room for regulation, but I think we've seen, speaking of harms, a lot of harm come from regulation in the past. And what I don't necessarily mean harm to the user and civil liberties, although I think that is like one aspect here. But I think we've been talking about industry versus civil society, but industry is not a monolith, right? There's startups, there's like incumbents, there's big players, there's small players, there's just like so many different kinds of companies out there. And coming back to your point and question, who can afford the lobbyists? It's not all of industry. It's not civil society. We heard that. It's not researchers, but it's not even like a representative slice of industry. Mm-hmm. And to say the expertise, like to close it off with where you started, to say the expertise resides in only those companies. Well, if that's true, maybe we should be looking at that as well.
Yeah.
But I don't believe that's entirely the case.
Yeah, I want to go back to the industry not a monolith point, because I think that's really important. But first, just to Nur briefly, if I can. So your point, Nick, about taxpayer dollars being put into expertise here. So I wrote a story last fall about some of the tech companies funding through a science agency that I won't name here, but funding a fellowship for folks on the Hill to work on AI. I got a lot of pushback from folks that I wouldn't expect, who said, listen, like, you're going to end up making it so that there's no expertise in Washington at all, because there is not money available, in the current political environment for this kind of expertise in the agencies on the Hill. The money's coming from the tech industry. Obviously, that's imperfect, but it's some expertise. It's some money. It's a compelling argument, because obviously we've talked a lot already about the influence concerns, but to Nick's point, having no understanding of the technology and just writing a regulation is even more concerning. So Nur, and then I think maybe Anat wants to say something too, but is that, how do you
can I say one more thing, and then I'll let other people speak?
Yeah.
So one of the things that motivated this panel was academic capture, and I think like there's this danger of a monolith with your comment, like, oh yeah, that's the only place the money is coming from, so we got to basically let those people have the voice. Well, fine, except that's not representative. And like we've seen that happen in academic peer review as well, where like a very small number of companies basically take over steering committees of conferences program and basically dictate where the research should go. And I think that's certainly true in my area. I'm sure I see other people nodding on that. So we're talking about Washington here, but I actually think we're talking about innovation in general.
Yeah. And to Nur, do you feel like there's a risk that you shut off policy expertise across the board if you crack down too hard on industry money flowing into the space? And, I guess potentially a question, a positive way to frame it is like, are there other pots of money available, for academics, for experts, for folks who want to work on these issues long term, but don't want to feel beholden to industry interests?
Yeah, no, certainly. I think there are certain sources that are funding, public interest research, but I guess related to industry, that's very little. Like that includes the U.S., Canada, the U.K., and everywhere else. Like if you look at the amount of funding the industry is putting in. Industry recently, say Microsoft said we're going to put in $100 billion for our compute resources. And then if you look at, say, federal government put in for compute resources for academics and startups, I think, I'm trying to recall the numbers, it's less than $500 million over a three-year period. So that means less than $500 million versus over like almost $100 billion just by one company. So, I mean, in terms of amount of money, I think, yes, academics they are limited by the resources that are available to them. But I do see a lot of passion within academia, within public interest, technologists, as well as within civil society. They have the expertise. They want to pursue their line of work in certain ways. Like Laura talked about, maybe we will try to, they're working on, like a different kind of deep learning or a different kind of AI, which wouldn't require that much compute and data. So there are certain kinds of resources available, but I don't think that's enough. So so there are concerns like we need to diversify these funding resources. Like, like say other organizations, like say other foundations could come in and like fund some of those, research areas. So I want to share one good news though. So next week I will release a paper on responsible AI research, like which actors are engaging in. So where we actually find that industry has not been, industry does not fund majority of those papers. So industry funds only roughly 3% of the papers in AI ethics or responsible AI. I think which is a good thing in a way that industry does not have like all the influence. But the bad thing is that field is very nascent and very small. Mm-hmm. So that field needs a lot more funding and resources.
Cool. And compared to a field like AI safety, which again is kind of money, there's a lot of money going into that. And I want to talk about this actually from the perspective of industry versus industry, because that's really interesting. So, and again, I mentioned this at the top, but there's a lot of interest and literally hundreds of millions of dollars going into this AI safety ecosystem, particularly in Washington and in the United Kingdom. Where there is an effort to sort of gin up concerns about artificial general intelligence, leading eventually to superintelligence. A lot of concerns about biosecurity, a lot of concerns about potentially AI, again, becoming sentient. And I've heard Laura talking about this a few minutes ago, for one reason or another, deciding to kill everybody. It's not always treated with a lot of credulity by researchers who I think have been working on this for a long time. But given the amount of money that's going into this field, particularly on one side, sort of ginning up the safety concerns, it's been quite impactful. I think you've seen it in a variety of policy spaces impact how the executive orders rolled out. I think you see how the U.S. AI Safety Institute at the Commerce Department is being rolled out, and there's a lot of voices there. What I have been seeing recently, though, is a pushback from other sectors of industry on this issue. And, to Corynne and other people's point that this isn't a monolith, the venture capitalists who are very much interested in the small AI startups that they're invested in are not fans of this push. So Andreessen Horowitz in particular has leaned in quite heavily on this, but there are others as well. And they are starting to come to Washington and to other policy centers and say, hey, listen, like the AI doomsday stuff that's being pushed by some of these groups and the efforts by like companies like Microsoft and OpenAI, Anthropic, sometimes Google, to kind of push licensing regimes to say, this technology is too dangerous for anybody but a handful of companies to be licensed to do this. They're pushing back on that. And, I think it might be too early to see how successful they are, but I am seeing signs that some of that message is getting through. There's a long lead up to just, I think for Corynne, why not just let industry duke this out? I mean, is there some sort of self-correcting mechanism here? I may be playing devil's advocate a little bit here, but the extent to which can the VCs and the startups, push back on the big concentrations of money here? I'm just saying specifically in the AI safety space, but maybe in a variety of policy contexts here. Like what's wrong with just letting industry v. industry, shake out, and the policymakers will get the best points of view that way.
So a couple of things. So one is, just to back up quickly, I do think that compared to 10 years ago, I actually do see the agencies at least staffing up with technologists in a way that they did not before. And not all those people are ex-Googlers or whatever. Some of them are, but not all. And I appreciate that. I mean, really compared to what things looked like 10 years ago, I do think has been some investment, especially in the current administration, recognizing that they really need like tech staff to be smarter. And so that is somewhat reassuring to me. And some of them are ex-EFFers, so that's good. And the reason that matters is because it's sort of the same thing. You cannot ask CEOs what your policy recommendations should be and what your rules should be, because they're just going to be self-interested. It's their whole job. They're not a reliable group. And I'm also seeing many more efforts to sort of try to train technologists from outside of Washington on how to speak tech to power. And I think that's important. And that can also come from academia. It's like, you have to learn, how do you talk to staffers? How do you talk to agencies in a way that they will understand and you can be persuasive? So I just want to, on that more high note. Now, I actually don't think it's a bad thing for VCs and representatives of the startup community to be part of this conversation. I think they should be part of this conversation because, and unfortunately, I think you do have to have the VCs to go in on behalf of the startups, because the startups are busy doing, the work. They're developing the technology. And I will tell you that when I started at EFF, these many years ago, there was very much the attitude in Silicon Valley. They didn't go to DC. They did not lobby. They were not doing that. It was a very no, DC is where bad things happen. We're in Silicon Valley. We're going to do good things and just ignore those guys. And then, but BIPA happened. There was lots of supervised regulations. They figured out okay, that's not going to work. So now, certain companies that figured that out are very influential. But the startups really struggled to be influential in the same way. The VCs are financially incentivized to be there and be at the table. And they represent an interest that I think is important. They just don't represent the only interest that is important. And so, but I 100% don't mind that we're not just going to rely on a few companies to tell us what the rules should be. And even on the most basic level, to explain how the technology works and what is possible. I was in a room with someone who was actually part of a healthcare startup. And it was incredibly interesting and changed the entire conversation that was happening already about AI and how AI should be regulated or not. Because he was saying, well, in the healthcare space, here's how it works, X and Y. And it was really different from the content moderation space or whatever. So it sort of feeds into the bigger problem, which is we can't treat this like a monolithic problem in multiple ways. It affects different sectors, some that are already regulated, some that aren't. And, I don't mean to make a hard problem harder, but it just is a hard problem. And I don't think that, unfortunately, our legislative processes don't lend themselves to really grappling with really complicated problems. People like simple solutions.
Yeah, and I should actually note it's not just big tech versus little tech on some of these issues. There's also, I think, particularly on open source, you see very large companies going at each other, and I'd love to talk a little bit about this. So, again, Microsoft very much pushing for a more closed source model, I think probably because of their partnership with OpenAI in a sense that would benefit them in some way. IBM and Meta, both very large companies, they've been pushing quite aggressively for open source. Again, they talk about it in a competition perspective, but they're actually pretty open. IBM in particular, just we need this because we're kind of behind on the frontier models, and this is a way we can catch up. And so, it's also big tech versus big tech. I just want to make that clear.
Just jump in on that, though, because I do think that this is one of the things where I don't think that staffers have a very good, or many people have a very good sense when they'll say open. Open means a lot of things, and it is used in very facile ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, for anybody, if you guys want to expand on that, the specific point, I think, because open source AI has become maybe the main hot button policy issue in Washington right now, certainly in the safety space. So what that means, but also just more broadly, the extent to which that sort of these conversations in the policy space, these definitions kind of make it very difficult for policymakers to get their arms around it, and they sort of fall back on the industry definition of open source or whatever, whatever that is. So I guess anybody can jump in. Anat, you want?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure I'm answering specifically about that, but about some of the conversation about expertise and cost of expertise and, government unable to do stuff, that is also a deeper problem, of course. And that goes back to the fact, to the sort of, winner takes all kind of society we have in which, we were told to loathe the government, that big myth, love free markets, and somehow then the government gets gutted out of expertise and all of that. But some of this, goes back to the government and to the, money in politics and whatever else is preventing the people from government from even using sources like unconflicted academics. So it doesn't even matter how passionate I would be about stuff. I lose. I lose because I cannot donate the kind of money to the politicians that the banks does. And that's it. So, the agencies, then you got the capture over there and who gets to hear their voice. I saw all of it very close and personal in banking. And now, just to the point of industry against industry, yes, again, it's very useful when you have balancing forces fighting out in regulation. In banking, maybe you could see this in the U.S. for a period of time after Glass-Steagall. You had commercial banks that had access to cheap deposit funding, and that created their, franchise value that some academics like to talk about. But they didn't have access to these IPOs and securities because of Glass-Steagall. And the investment banks, they had access to exciting IPOs, but they didn't have these cheap deposits. And so they were kind of holding each other at bay until they decided, if we merge, life could be even better. And so now they managed to, with Citigroup buying Travelers and the whole affair that happened in the 90s, after the law was already eroded a lot, all of a sudden it was gone. And we had the major, universal banks that we have today. They've always had them in Europe, so it's not like, the U.S. had this special law. But I'm saying that showed you how they could sort of fight out, where each one of them had a little goodie there that they were benefiting from. And then when they stopped fighting it out, that was probably bad.
Yeah, and I actually want to go to, I knew you were going to be interested in talking about that. Well, it's specifically in the open source context. Yeah, okay, because obviously we're seeing that play out right now, right? Yeah. Big companies versus big companies, and right now they're kind of trying to come to a...
Yeah. So I wouldn't use the word open source. I'm going to say a little bit of open versus closed. So recently Elon Musk launched their model. He said, we open our model, right? It's just model weights. If you look at the description of the model, it's less than a page. And you basically don't know what did they do during the whole process, right? So it's not really an open source model. It's just model weights that are available to some people. So how do we know which organizations are gonna be slightly more open versus closed? Look at the business model. So Microsoft, Google, they can make money by selling those models to their clouds. That's why they want those large models so that their enterprise users are going to buy those services from them. Versus Meta doesn't have that kind of services, so they cannot make money in that way. So that's why Meta does not sell, Meta is more open than others, because Meta is we want this ecosystem who can help us more, and we can actually innovate and incorporate some of those features into our current products. So business model can answer who's going to be more open versus who's going to be more closed.
Well, and to Anat's point that, when banks were able to balance off each other, it was better for folks. And when they got united on this, do you see a scenario? I mean, how do you think this open versus closed debate's going to play out? And how long do you think that balance can persist?
I mean, it's hard to predict. I mean, it's probably going to take at least a few years to see where things go, because there are, different kind of predictions. So it's possible that these large AI models, there's going to be a wall, and, you won't be able to improve the performance for too long. And if that's the case, then we will have many more open models. But if we continue to improve those model performance, then I think it's going to take a little bit more time. So I think it depends partly also on the technological path we are going to take.
Okay, yeah, thanks. We're coming pretty close to audience questions, so I want to give you guys a chance to kind of mull those. But I've got a couple more for the panelists first. And Nick, I'll go to Nick if that's okay. And feel free, anybody, to jump in on this. We've been talking a lot about the problems of industry influence in policymaking and academia and think tanks and sort of the research that drives much of this policymaking. Let's talk a little bit, if we can, about solutions, potential solutions. Nick, I'm curious if you see sort of a way out of this death spiral. I don't want to overstate it, but this increasing, I would say, influence, particularly in the tech space, of a handful of companies, despite the balancing act that some of them play with each other. I guess one way to ask this is, how do academics make sure to keep an arm's length from their funders, or if they avoid funding altogether?
I was going to take your question a totally different way.
That's fine too.
But yeah. We going to the glimmer of hope section of the panel.
Let's do it.
I think we had a brief discussion of privacy there for a minute, and I actually, what I'm about to say isn't totally well formed yet, but I think there's some interesting developments in the area of AI and data here as it pertains to innovation for small companies and as it relates to privacy. So here's what I mean. So I think it's a couple of weeks ago, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about synthetic data generation. And I think the area of generative AI for synthetic data generation, I think is very, very exciting. In my own research, we've been doing a lot of work using models like Stable Diffusion and Mamba to do things like generate network traffic traces, like, basically the traffic that goes over the internet. You're like, well, that's cute, but like, does it have any use? And so I don't know yet, but I see Kamal sitting over there in the audience. So for about a year, maybe longer, Kamal, I don't know, it feels like it ages. Okay, I've been trying to get data from our campus network so that I could train some models to do things related to application quality inference. Now, the issue there, without getting into all the details, is that, like, there's private information in network traffic, as we all know, right? And so how do you so here we've got some research going. We've got a startup company. We're trying to basically, like, train models to do cool things. Now, either you're like Facebook or Google and you have a lot of private information already, or you are in a privileged place where you can get that data and, like, oh, yeah, trust us, we're only going to use it for good. Or you're basically an entrant, whether that's a researcher, right, or a startup company, and you can't get that data in ways. And actually, by the way, the privacy regulations that everybody thought were so awesome are basically standing in the way of innovation once again, because we're sitting here, we can't get access to data that, we're trying to do stuff with. So there's side effects of regulations coming in again. But I think the generative AI space, in particular in the area of synthetic data generation, holds huge benefits for privacy because think of that situation. Well, if I don't have to ask for the private data, right? But if instead, Kamal, can I just have basically data that looks like the application traffic I want so that I can train my models? By the way, it's not just me. Think of any two companies trying to basically broker a data exchange. This could be an ML as a service model, like wanting to deploy something on premises in an enterprise. Could be two other companies. Yeah, I don't want to give you my private data, or maybe I can't because the regulations prevent me from doing so. But here, I can give you something that looks like that data that's going to help you develop the model that helps me. And so I think there's a lot of promise in this area, maybe some benefits for privacy if we can get away from some of the potential harms in the data scraping area, which I'll leave to somebody else.
Just to make sure I understand that, so from an influence perspective, you're not so much talking about access to money or capital but for researchers, but more about access to data from so like if there's
for sure, which ultimately is money. But yes.
Yeah. So that's one potential approach to sort of keep the big industry in particular more at arm's length.
I think it's a potential equalizer.
Yeah. Okay. Jump ball for Anat or Corynne, just in terms of ways to solve this this issue of think tankers and researchers being sort of beholden to their funders, or again to the people that have all the data on this space. How can we kind of lessen some of those influence concerns as they relate to AI policy or just policymaking generally?
Well, I can speak a little bit to that. I think that, there are many, many institutions, including academic institutions, that can look in the mirror and ask themselves how they can do better. So I think I always start kind of close to home. The AI is one shiny object these days. The other one is sustainability at Stanford. Sustainability that opens a lot of doors, if you say that magic word. And there we have a big debate about, the sustainability school and whether you should take money from oil companies and all of that. So it's the same everywhere. But, the key is for a lot of institutions, including academic institutions, is transparency about conflicts of interest. That's like a basic starting point of any discussion of how you generate your conclusion, who supported it, and all of that. We need a competent government. What it would take to collect enough taxes to do that, so that they can hire people, or that they, can choose to listen to people who, and understand what they're saying and all of that. That's a long order. But I do think that in a lot of the institutions that are supposedly hovering and opining about this, including media, including academia, including think tank, and all of that. We start with just knowing where we are and being honest. With the obvious objective is to, avoid the corruption of knowledge, to empower truth, all these good words.
Corynne, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Sure. So actually EFF has spent a lot of time thinking about this, partly because we've been repeatedly accused of being Google shells, because we took Cypre money from a Google privacy lawsuit, which is like, for those of you who don't know, Cypre is like what you do with the leftover settlement money, and the court can decide where it should go, and we're a privacy organization, so it went to us. And as a result of that, there was an organization that decided that EFF got funding from Google directly, which we didn't. And as a result of that, we get accused of being Google shells, even though we are up against them all the time. And our thing with them is like, we will stand with big tech when they stand with the users, and we are against them when they don't. And so we have a long history of dealing with this issue. And I do think that, you can't totally fix it. I mean, I don't feel personally upset about it. I know how my organization works, and I know that we're not influenced, but outside people don't know that. Okay. So what do? You have to, again, you are as transparent as possible in how you accept money. We try to be also very clear that, we take donations. Of course we do. We're a nonprofit. That's how we survive. But we take donations almost always. They're what are called general. I don't work on the fundraising side. I just know this. But we take general purpose funds. And what that means is we take money and then we decide how it gets spent. And we actually doesn't even mean the board. This is sort of a thing that's unusual about EFF as a nonprofit. The staff decides what our priorities are. The staff decides what is best for the internet, what we need to do at this time, and how to, what we need to deal with, and what our priorities should be. The board does not decide that. And I think that is a better model, and it's a good, it gives the, because I think this is actually not the key thing. It's not just the perception. It is actually really, really important that the staff know and feel confident that if they have an idea about what to do, they don't have to worry about whether some funder is going to be okay with it or not, and that changes the culture of your organization. I will admit it's a luxury. Smaller nonprofits, they don't have that luxury. And lots of, organizations don't have that luxury. But where you do, I think, that you should take advantage of it and make sure people know about it, because it leads to better work, which is the key part of the whole thing. Also leads to happier staffers who probably aren't getting paid as much as they could.
Yeah,
in private sector.
And I should just note, it's not, in my reporting on this, I found just as much that it's not just, staffers at these organizations or researchers feeling like they can't say what they want to say, but also that they sort of feel compelled to say certain things as well. And that gets back to my point about biosecurity and AI risks. And again, right now, that's where I feel like the Nexus is really, particularly in the AI safety space, you're getting a lot of that. And there are a lot of biosecurity researchers who feel sort of pressured to gin up some of these risks. So it really does go both ways, like what you can't say and then kind of what you should be saying, because the influence of that $5 million grant looming just around the horizon next year, if that vanishes, there's a whole institution behind you that's sort of relying on you to at least find some sort of nexus between AI and biosecurity. So yeah, really interesting points all around. I think now we're going to open it to questions. We have about 10, 15 minutes. Want somebody over here? Okay, yeah.
Hi, I'm a freelance journalist based in Brussels. I regularly cover conferences funded by big tech. You said that this conference... yeah. You said that this conference would have looked very differently if it had been funded by big tech. I can imagine it would have had more lawyers, probably someone from Google or Facebook. But in terms of the subject, in terms of perhaps the arguments that would have been made, what would that have looked like?
Well, for example, you wouldn't have possibly gotten Lina Khan and Cantor by themselves. I mean, they would have had to deal with, a whole, other side. And I've been in those panels many times when, it's a balanced panel, as was described, in Davos, in all kinds of locations where, they'll bring varied opinions. So you got, nonsense, other opinion, and they get equal time. So that's what can happen. Now, it might not be nonsense. It could be a good discussion. And even between, multiple academics, we saw some spirited discussions, and they were not industry themselves. So, at least here, the discussions are usually between academics in this conference, as opposed to like people with labels on them that they are coming from industry. The industry sponsored this conference. We would have to probably have actual industry people or people that the industry approves of, and it would have looked different. The organizers can maybe opine on that too, but or they can try to imagine what they would have done potentially differently, and would it have worked, or how much compromise they would have had to make if the conference was funded by big tech, which I think it's not.
These are some pretty meta questions we're getting into now. We should bring the organizers up here. Do you have another one over here? Okay. They're like, no.
Hi, I'm a journalist as well from CNBC India, part of the Stigler's program. I want to ask Nur, or if anyone else, is there any competition among these generative, LLM models or generative AI to give the source? I tried with ChatGPT asking the question, why don't you tell me your source? And he or she said that, I look at many publicly available sources and use my own intelligence. And actually, if you do a Google on how Bard gives you an FAQ, Bard says the same thing, that we'll cite where we quote exactly, otherwise it's my original intelligence. Now, is there any competition among the LLMs to give the source? If there is that kind of a competition, we are kind of somewhat secured.
So I think Laura is a better person to answer this question. But my point about that would be, yes, some companies are definitely working on that. Part of the reason is if they can solve some of these problems, like they can potentially launch a better Google. Say Perplexity is trying, and there are other companies who are trying to do something like that. But it is also important to understand LLM itself, the core foundation. It's just a pattern recognizer, right? So.
Language models just don't do that. Sorry. Yes.
Do you have more? Yeah? Oh, I think we are getting some feedback from the organizers. Asked and delivered.
I'm happy to say this conference is not funded by big tech, but I'm happy to also say, I was going to say in the final remarks that we got a small grant from the Knight Foundation for the drinks yesterday. So you can thank them for the beer and the wine. But Chicago Bull funded this conference. But I had a question for... I got a question actually So one of the things that's interesting about computer sciences as an academic area is that the conferences are also the publication venues, right? So for most of the time. And then the conferences are, I think, Nick, you're touching a little bit more about it. I wonder if you can develop this a little bit more. So how do you think about the gatekeeping role of academia when academia itself becomes beholden to the amount of money that goes into conferences? And if there's, is this possible to change? How this has impacted the field? How have you witnessed that? And so anything you can say will be interesting, or anyone else who knows about it.
Yeah, I think it is possible. Although I think, one of the fundamental rules of organizations is that they're organized for self-preservation. And I think the conference enterprise is sort of a prime example of that. Take the conferences in my area. Go look at the steering committees and the program committees. What fraction of those program committees are from Google, Microsoft? I'll stop there. Then go look at the funders. Okay, it's Google and Microsoft. Wait a second. I actually was on some of the steering committees for several of these conferences. One in my area is called Network Systems Design and Implementation. I was on that committee for many years to Empathy. I was like one of the few people on that steering committee not from industry. I suggested, hey, maybe we should separate the papers that are basically industry experience papers from like research papers, the ones that basically are just Google white papers explaining their 5-year-old data center technology that nobody can replicate. In other words, not science, but advertisement. And I was shot down. Guess why? Because basically the rest of the steering committee was Google and Microsoft. Guess what? I'm no longer on that steering committee. Why? Because part of it was I saw no room to move the needle, but also you quickly become persona non grata when you're telling your colleagues that they're basically submitting white paper advertisements in research paper clothing. And then you look at the organization that's, to your point, running the conference. They've got no incentive to basically tell these people to speak truth to power either, because who's funding the conference? Google. So there you have it. I mean, it's unfortunately a little bit of a death spiral. But I actually think the way out might be to get out of the conference business, right? I mean, we have great publication mechanisms like Archive that actually they disseminate knowledge much, much faster. Now, not all of it's peer reviewed, right? So we gotta watch out for quality control. But there are much faster, much more efficient, much less gatekeeping prone mechanisms to disseminate knowledge these days. And it baffles me that we're in the era of like the 1980s where we're talking about research papers and like getting together and listening to PowerPoints as our primary mode of disseminating information. It's ridiculous. There's cheaper ways to do this. There's faster ways to do this. There are ways that we can do it in ways that are peer reviewed that don't have like two companies as gatekeepers.
Well, if Luigi was here, he would have definitely brought up the field of medicine and publications in that field that we've started looking at. Pharma controls a lot of the knowledge and the journals too. So even, true that in many of the social science fields, there's still a problem about data and data sources and all that, but the problem is just across the board. It's variations on a theme. I actually recently, within the last year, since I was in this conference last time, I learned a new word. It's called agnotology. So agnotology is about creating ignorance or about kind of controlling. And it's a word that was dubbed by historians who started asking, related to the what they study, they started asking, we're studying history, what we know, and of course, that goes to AI and generative AI, but what is it that we don't know, and why don't we know it? Or, what is it that we're confused about, and why it is that we're confused about it? So they started asking who controls what we know, and who wants us to remain ignorant about something, and all of that. And they had a 2-day conference that I attended just in May of last year, just less than a year ago, which was just fascinating and had a lot of different studies from different areas, showing the way in which people controlled basic knowledge. And, there's examples I can give, but we are running out of time.
Yeah, I just want to react really quickly to a couple things Nick said. One, it's funny that the way I heard what you were saying, at least, was sort of, these digital tools that have been created or driven forward by many of these big tech giants are actually potentially a way to sort of break their stranglehold over some of the propagation of the research that drives policy. Yeah, and maybe there needs to be more of that, which I find really interesting. Also, just acknowledge on the white paper thing. We periodically cover the kind of white papers that come out of these companies, and it did the constant sort of concern, or I guess there's always this sort of like sense of like you don't want to. I think it's very useful as sort of a signaling mechanism for where the companies are in these specific points of view. But there is always this sort of sense of like, be careful not to give too much credence to this, because it looks like an academic paper. It's got all this like. But to your point, it often is just sort of a signal.
That's just it. I mean, it's not that we don't have plenty to learn from this information. I mean, I think we all want to read it, and that's basically why everyone's like, yeah, awesome, let's get these papers in. But it's really a question of what's the veneer of legitimacy on that.
And that's we've basically brought, I think, every major institution in through the ringer here except the media. And as a representative of the media, that's probably an oversight on my part. But that is something that you see. So I'll try. You did, and I'll try to, in the interest of intellectual honesty here, note that there are sometimes journalists who I think will, unquestioningly take some of those white papers with very interesting information, because these are the companies that are driving at the cutting edge of this technology. They're the only ones with access to this, and treat it like an uninterested, non-ideological, non-biased paper. And so that is, like any other institution, that is a risk in our institution as well, that we have to guard against. I think we have time for maybe, sorry. Okay, please, you've got the thing.
I'm Utsav. I'm a pre-doctoral student with the Stigler Center. So with the conference, we've heard a lot about the American perspective and the European perspective. I was actually curious about the rest of the world. I don't know, any of you can speak to other countries where maybe like the tech companies have a large presence and might be the only source of funding for small organizations or independent researchers. How should they navigate these same issues?
Sorry, go ahead. So I just came from an event from at Stanford HAI, actually. I was there. I was one of the panelists there. And we actually talked about tech companies and their role, in diffusing AI in the global south. So the thing is, and the paper that I will be releasing next week on archive. So we actually look at like to what extent tech companies like examining questions related to the global south, and we find that they are not paying much attention to that. So, and I mean, because the incentives are not aligned. I mean, they don't have to care about them because they don't have that much power, and that's why they're not taking into consideration how these tools might harm these kind of people. And also in terms of researchers, again, like, because AI is a really capital intensive field at the moment. So it's not easy for those researchers to actually get into it and really offer competing models or ask really those hard questions. Like, hey, you created this model, this is what's happening. Right? For example, say Elon Musk released this model, like very few organizations can even load that model to even analyze what's in there, right? And of course, they didn't disclose the basic things about that model. So for Global South, unfortunately at the moment, I don't have any good news, but we definitely need to think about that.
Something about the Global South too.
Go ahead. Yeah. Very quickly.
Well, if you go back to, I looked into content moderation by some of the social media companies, say Facebook or Meta, and they were spending all the money in the U.S. They didn't even translate the terms of the community standards to many of the languages in which Facebook exists. And then in India, there was an interesting battle about net neutrality, which had to do with Facebook Basics, which is one of the ways that for many people, the only entry to the internet was through Facebook. And then Facebook walled off things. And then you had a few, in an incredible story, you had a few activists producing fun videos explaining to the public against a barrage of Facebook telling people on the platform. And of course, there was a lot of violence in Myanmar and in India that is propagated there, controlled by Modi and all that. So there's a lot of issues in the global south from just the old-fashioned, social media. AI, I'm sure, adds a layer.
I'm glad you
quickly the last other show over.
I'm glad you brought up free basics because I had that in my head and I saw it nodding over here. I mean, this is an example of basically a big tech company going into a new market. And essentially, exploiting is kind of a loaded term, but essentially I think it's fair to say that you're exploiting basically inequities, right? So it's like, okay, well, these people don't have as much money as we do. So let's basically enter this market and take advantage of that to basically get access and again, data. And I think another topic that I work on in my research is equity. Equity of internet access historically, but one of the things that I think we see that I have not tackled in my own work yet, but is apparent, is that when you bring connectivity into a region where there are inequities, suddenly you get other kinds of equalizing. There's $60 billion now to bring internet access and make that somehow equitable. That's the beginning of the problem because now we have gathering of data, we got privacy issues, security, safety. All that data is going to be feeding these AI models. So I think the next frontier is going to be like, well, where is that data coming from?
Yeah. Cool. Corynne, if you want to weigh in this very quickly, and then we're going to do one more question and then wrap it. Okay, great. Megan, I know you had your hand raised if you still want to do it. And then that's the cutoff.
Hello, Megan Gray of Gray Matters. I just had a quick question. In listening to y'all, that I was struck by with civil society being the token in so many of these meetings. In one respect, it's great that you at least have that one token in the meetings, because in standards meetings, where so many of these things are decided, you don't even have the token. And I think it's because it's not as visible. You don't have the optics. You don't have that sort of leverage. Is there a way that we could find a way to have that token in technical standard bodies? And two, I wonder if there's a way, like we have seen over the last 7 years with the elimination of manels, if we could use some of that pressure to visually designate on panels, this is somebody who's from big tech, this is somebody who is not, to try to very visually and viscerally identify that this is not a balanced perspective that's being portrayed.
Yeah, Corynne, right of first refusal here.
Yeah, 100%. So actually EFF has some experience with trying to engage with standards processes, and it is a struggle. It is not I think folks who've been around for a while have an image of standards processes from like 2 decades ago, and it's like a bunch of technologists are in the room and they'll figure things out. And I wasn't around then, so I don't know. But I can tell you now, that's not how it works, and it hasn't been for a while. The people who influence a lot of technical standards are the people who can afford to send people year after year, month after month, and engage in these conversations. And civil society just can't do it. We tried in a couple places, and Cory Doctorow, God love him, fought the good fight around DRM and browsers. But it's just, we have to make choices about our donors' money and where we can actually be influential and where we can't. And standards bodies are not usually a good use of that money. And I don't really know how to fix that, to be honest with you, because it's just such a long game. You really have to have endurance. And so to me, a better path there would actually for academics. I think I could see maybe academics coming in and getting some funding to, again, though, it's a long-term thing. You got to be there for a while, and there's a lot of money on the other side. And then to your other question, I mean, frankly, I get invited to panels all the time. They're like, oh, hi, civil society. That already happens. And it's okay. I mean, I'm glad to be here to have a conversation and talk to people from different sectors. That's not a problem. But I don't think, to be honest, the change isn't going to happen in conferences like this. I mean, I think it's important for us to share knowledge and insights with each other. That is worth doing. But that's not how the change happens. The change happens when we're in the room where it happens.
I think we go ahead, Nick. Yeah, and then
I think this to the standards question. I think I agree with everything Corynne says. I think it's worth noting that the IETF over the last maybe 5 years, I've seen new working groups related to human rights considerations, et cetera, which didn't exist at all before. So that's good. And you see groups like the Center for Democracy and Technology and others chairing those groups. But I think everything that Corynne says, money, resources, etc. Also, it's on the side. It's over here. There's this research group, this working group is dedicated to that. And meanwhile, there's standards working groups over here, cranking out standards. And so, I don't know, much like the discussion of ethics, the instruction of ethics in computer science and thinking about integrative approaches, I find it a bit weird that you've got human rights thing over here and they're writing documents, and then you've got standard stuff going on over here. So we got a ways to go, but.
Nur, Anat, burning last thoughts on that question or anything?
Just to say that, academics also have incentive to publish in their journals. So even going to this advisory board, which I've seen play out, and where I saw it play out, some people, some place will want, somebody unconflicted, other people won't. So it really varies with the policies. People is policy, but anyway, so it's hard to, play that game long term. And most academics don't want to.
So I'm a pre-tenure academic. I can't play that long game yet. So
I say to people, don't go there before tenure. So why are you here?
Well, we'll leave that for another panel, another conference. With that, we are out of time. I'm supposed to say this, but in this case, I really believe it. This was a great panel. This was really, really interesting. We obviously went a little over time, but I think that was because of all the engaging answers. I want to give a round of applause to our panelists. And everybody who stuck around to the end, you're in on the live stream. Thanks so much. And I think our organizer has a few words that he wants to
just some final words. So thank you. I actually have an answer for the question because I did ask ChatGPT how would the Stigler conference look like if it was funded by big tech. And the answer was the conference would feature prominent figures from big tech as keynote speakers, along with academics and policymakers who have collaborated with or have interests aligned with the tech industry.
I've been to that conference. Yeah.
Big tech companies will use the conference as an opportunity to showcase their latest innovations and products. So I think this starts to give you an answer that comes from the companies themselves.